Chapter 14, The Vase and Sword Incident, Violent Confrontation in Buckingham. The so-called Incident of the Vase and the Sword, also known as the Incident of the Infamous King and the Angry Lord, is one of those anecdotal episodes in history that in their own time were considered probably apocryphal, an event discarded by some as a simple gossip or rumor without foundation, but seen by others as an event for the most part real. But the people closest to the court of Queen Victoria knew that something serious and real had happened that day, although very few people knew the whole truth. Several years later, the events that took place in that small room in Buckingham Palace began to be confirmed, when the heirs of one of the main actors of the drama, now with nothing to lose, began to spread their version of the incident, which forced the others involved to tell their own version of the controversial fact. The truth is that that day a tragedy could have happened that could have seriously altered the fate of Queen Victoria's reign, and thereby have conditioned the later British history. More controversial and serious are the alleged causes of that violent confrontation, in which some blood was spilled, because the accusation against Victoria could have forced her to abdicate. Victoria and Lord Melbourne, the birth of a romantic and passionate era / the precursor roots of the sexual revolution in the 19th century, by Pamela Jernigan, Chapter 9, The Violent Incident That Would Have Changed History. It had been a dizzying few weeks since the wedding of Victoria and Lord Melbourne. They tried to postpone as much as possible the official announcement of Victoria's pregnancy, to try to discourage gossip and malicious rumors, and make credible that the child was of Lord Melbourne. But the growing discomfort and the considerable growth of Victoria's belly forced them not to wait as long as everyone would have wanted, especially Victoria's mother and Uncle Leopold. So whole Great Britain was notified that her Queen's recent marriage to her unorthodox husband had been blessed with the upcoming arrival of a child, a presumptive heir to the crown. Most of the British greeted the idea with joy, but in the newspapers there were some very veiled insidious insinuations, almost always in the letters to the editor. They were surprised by how quickly the Queen had become pregnant, and wondered how much time would pass before the birth of the new prince or princess. However, the cowardly and ill-intentioned insinuations were ignored by the majority, at least for the time being. But it would be decisive when Victoria would give birth to her first child, the posthumous child of Albert, because if the child was rushing to get to the world, that would complicate things a lot. That is why the people around Victoria who knew the shameful secret behind her motherhood prayed that the delivery would be delayed instead of to anticipate, including Victoria's husband, the man who had assumed the ungrateful role of marrying her while she was pregnant with another man, to save her from shame and from a catastrophic and premature end to her still young reign. But Victoria herself did not share those desires, for she was increasingly desperate and anguished. Desperate because she suffered impatiently the discomforts of her pregnancy, and distressed because the shadow of the tragic death of her cousin Charlotte, the first wife of her uncle Leopold, when giving birth to her only child, who also died in the disastrous birth, tormented her, fearing to run the same sad fate of that female cousin she never knew. Meanwhile, Victoria was also sad and a little disappointed by her marriage to Lord Melbourne. She could not complain that he was cold, cruel, or indifferent to her, because on the contrary he was very affectionate with her, he treated her with enough love and tenderness. Lord Melbourne struggled to comfort Victoria in those moments when she felt more depressed or irritated by her discomforts and fears. He was as or more charming than when he was her Prime Minister, secretary, and best friend, besides the first man she fell in love with. They spent most of the day together, alone, or in the company of relatives and members of the court of Victoria, and really only separated, in the day, when she had to work on her official duties, especially when she had to receive Prime Minister Peel. But the problem came at night. Every night Lord Melbourne said goodbye to Victoria with a kiss on the cheek, and then he retired to his bedroom, and she to her own. Victoria had given up hope of having intimate relationships with her husband before giving birth, and simply would have been satisfied that he slept beside her, in the same bed, even if it was the innocent way in which a children would do. But Lord Melbourne insisted politely on having his own bedroom and sleeping in it. Victoria was comprehensive to Lord Melbourne, and even she felt guilty and ashamed, for it had been her embarrassing behavior that caused her husband to avoid sexual contact with her, being pregnant with Albert. How could a man be reproached for not fulfilling his conjugal duties in privacy when that man had married a pregnant woman for another man, to save her from scandal and humiliation? If Lord Melbourne had been a greedy and scoundrel, if he would have married her for interest, for hunger for wealth, and only for that reason would he have been willing to ignore Victoria's indecent behavior, in that case Victoria would not have felt guilt or remorse. But she knew perfectly well that he had not married out of ambition, but out of love, and that was why he had saved her. And for that reason she lamented that the best man in the world had to settle for a wife like her, and with a marriage like that, when he deserved a woman who honored him. Despite that, even though she could not get angry with him or claim anything, she felt frustrated and insecure. Victoria had little experience with passion, with lust, having had sex only once and in very unsatisfactory conditions, drunk and losing her virginity with a clumsy, deficient and abrupt lover, but she knew enough to know that she desired Lord Melbourne. Her body demanded lust, she wanted to feel loved and above all desired, now that her body was experiencing those unpleasant changes, especially the fatness of her belly that she hated so much. She would have begged on her knees for Lord Melbourne to touch her, to caress her body, so that he would just put his hands on her arms, her shoulders, her breasts, or just lie down beside her and grab her hand. Victoria feared that her marriage would always be that way, that even after giving birth, Lord Melbourne could never forget, and that theirs was a cordial marriage but without passion, without a passionate intimate life between them. No, it definitely had not been a good start for their marriage. But that night Victoria tried to forget her regrets and worries. There was a party in the palace, a celebration with a somewhat frivolous excuse, and that all those attending the event would soon forget, as they would only remember that night because of the incident that everyone would end up knowing with the passage of time. Victoria wanted to take advantage of one of the last parties she could attend. Soon her pregnancy would not allow her to go to any party, and then she would have to stop celebrating those social events in the palace. The idea of having to remain in seclusion made Victoria bitter, and that is why tonight she wanted to savor every minute and enjoy as much as possible, although she could not dance or drink. The party started beautifully. Lord Melbourne took her arm while both made their triumphal entry to start the party. He whispered in her ear and did not stop making lovely and funny comments, while telling her several times how beautiful she was that night. Victoria knew that he did it to inspire her and keep her happy, as he always did in the most difficult moments for her, and because Lord Melbourne knew that she felt fat and ugly. Victoria appreciated the attention of her husband, and that made her feel more optimistic about the future of their relationship. So Victoria and Lord Melbourne behaved like excellent hosts, because now Lord Melbourne was also host at Buckingham Palace, as consort of the Queen, and when they were not together, they moved in different directions from the huge hall where the celebration was held. Party and dance, each one met with groups of guests and conversed with them, and laughter was frequent. But Victoria got tired often, and had to sit on a sofa. She felt the fatigue that her pregnancy caused her, particularly in her swollen feet. When she was sitting, her mother, Emma, Harriet, or Lazan were always there to keep her company, and Lord Melbourne also came to sit with her for a few minutes until she insisted that he continue to entertain the guests with his charm and sense of humor. Victoria saw the couples dance and felt a certain envy, but she was also touched because she knew that Lord Melbourne had gently excused himself all night so as not to have to dance in front of his wife who could not do it. She resigned herself to studying the faces of the many people attending the party and dedicating herself to the game of remembering each person's name and biography. But there were people whose presence did not distract or amuse Victoria, but filled her with restlessness or irritation. Uncle Leopold had come from Belgium on one of his frequent visits, perhaps too frequent for Victoria's taste, and he paced the party with his usual arrogance. Leopold had always had the ability to irritate Victoria, to anger her, with his constant determination to control her and tell her what to do, and to reprimand her when she did something that he thought was wrong or unworthy of her role as queen. Although Victoria recognized the merit of Leopold for having initiated the necessary effort to make possible the wedding of her with Lord Melbourne, although his contribution had been important, although Lord Melbourne's friend, Lord George, and Lord M himself had made a contribution more important to the process, and that's why Victoria knew she was in debt to him, she could not help but despair and get irritated because of him, and now that with her pregnancy everything bothered her much more. The last thing she needed was Leopold exercising like a severe teacher or a scolding uncle. Deep down Victoria loved him, but it was the affection someone feels for an annoying and obtrusive relative. For whom Victoria felt no affection, it was for her paternal uncle the Duke of Cumberland, and also King of Hanover, who was the other annoying character of that night. Victoria hated Cumberland because she knew he hated her, and he hated her because she had been the obstacle that stood between him and the throne of Great Britain. If that condemned girl had not been born, or if she had died at birth or as a child, Cumberland would be the King of England, and not just the king of a small and poor kingdom among the many sovereign and independent principalities in which Germany was divided in those times. Quite sure Cumberland cursed the day when that damn German princess married to his brother gave birth to that girl who moved him in the line of succession to the British crown, truncating his expectations in life. The suffering people of Hanover had to pay the price, suffering the tyranny of a despotic king. Victoria knew that her feelings for her wicked uncle were not simple paranoia, because all her loved ones, including Lord Melbourne, shared her feelings and opinions about that scoundrel. They even took seriously the possibility that he would try to attack his niece's life before she could give birth to an heir to the crown, because if she died without heirs he would be the new king of the United Kingdom. But in addition, everyone suspected that Cumberland was behind those cowardly suggestions about the paternity of Victoria's child, or at least about the time the child was conceived, through his puppets that wrote the pamphlets distributed in the streets or letters to the editor sent to newspapers. For Victoria, Lord Melbourne, and the couple's trusted people at the court, it was obvious that Cumberland was trying to discredit his niece and sabotage her reign, trying to generate a crisis that would force Victoria to abdicate, or at least take revenge on her for the sin of being born. Although Victoria had wanted to break any relationship with the wicked uncle who hated her and only wished to hurt her, even though she would have liked to forbid him to set foot in England again, she knew she could not do it. Unfortunately, the politics prevented it. Trying to banish her uncle was almost impossible, because after all he was still a member of the British royal family, although he was also king of a foreign country, and whatever Victoria did to break relations with him, Cumberland would know how to reverse them so that Victoria would seem a madwoman who acted out of caprice and resentment. So Victoria was forced to treat him like any member of the royal family and invite him to official celebrations, hoping that he would stay in his little Germanic kingdom and not attend the parties to which he was invited. But sometimes he would attend, if only to annoy Victoria with his presence. That night Victoria felt revulsion whenever she saw him walking around the room, with his insolent arrogance and his cynical gesture on his face. The anger that Victoria felt became almost a physical discomfort, surely favored by her pregnancy, and she almost felt gagging to see him, as if it were a disgusting thing that would produce in her desire to vomit. The greeting between Victoria and Lord Melbourne on the one hand, and Cumberland on the other was very cold and tense, though tempered by social politeness and political diplomacy, though Cumberland said some cynical words that seemed to provoke Victoria and her husband, but Lord Melbourne responded with sarcasm and wit, not exempt from rage. To make matters worse, the damned Cumberland had brought a lapdog. Him was Ludwig Schultz, a captain of the Hanoverian army, who served as an aide-de-camp to Cumberland, in his capacity as King of Hanover. The man was as unpleasant as his master, exuded servility with Cumberland and contemptuous arrogance with the rest of the people. Schultz was young, he was little over 30 years old. He was more or less tall, with a thin, muscular build, very white skin and blonde hair, with a thick mustache. His face was attractive, and as a whole could be considered a handsome man, but his arrogant attitude, a man who looked with disdain at everybody, considering himself superior to most, and the grim and cynical gesture of his face, made him be unfriendly to almost anyone who knew him. When Cumberland introduced him to Victoria and Lord Melbourne as his aide-de-camp, the impression he made on both of them could not be worse. His greeting to Lord Melbourne was not deferential as it should be to someone who was superior to him, for he was the consort of the British Queen, but rather it was cold and almost discourteous, bordering on the contemptuous. And his greeting to Victoria was insolent, for he saw her in a way that seemed to mix disdain, mockery, and a certain lust. Like a despicable man, boorish and cruel, he would see a prostitute with whom he wished to go to bed but at the same time despised her. Lord Melbourne clenched his fists in anger when he saw the way the insolent man saw Victoria's cleavage, while she felt uncomfortable and angry. Cumberland smiled mockingly. From this behaviour, Victoria and Lord Melbourne deduced that Cumberland had been such a scoundrel that he had talked to his servile aide about Victoria, and he would have referred to her in derogatory terms, as if she were a prostitute. The hatred of both grew, but still nothing foreshadowed what was going to happen. At one point in the evening, Lord Melbourne was talking to Leopold, which was not so usual, since both men had hated each other since they met. But since Lord Melbourne had married Victoria, the relationship between the King of Belgium and his niece's consort had improved a little, though there was still some suspicion in their conversations. But that night they had a few minutes of civilized talk about different aspects of politics, when Lord Melbourne's friend Lord George approached them. "George, I waited for you for quite some time. It is rare that you arrive late to a party with good food and fun," Lord Melbourne said in a slightly mocking tone when he approached them. "Your Majesty," George said to Leopold with a slight nod. William continued to see his friend Lord Melbourne. "I apologize, but something important came up at the last moment and he was informing me, and getting evidence. I am afraid that it is about that matter we are talking about and requires your immediate attention," he added with a serious gesture. "Is it about Victoria? Cumberland? You can speak with confidence in front of His Majesty, as Victoria's uncle, must get to know whatever," replied Lord Melbourne, also becoming very serious. "In that case, may I suggest to your Majesty and to you, William, that we go to a private place to talk," George said in a tone that left no doubt about the urgency. The three men went to a small room adjacent to the main hall, and once there, George hurriedly pulled out some papers from a folder he was carrying with him, and then the disgust and anger arose in Leopold and Lord Melbourne. "Are you sure this will be published tomorrow?" Leopold asked as he waved a piece of paper in his hand. "Yes, sir. I have my sources in the press, as Lord Melbourne knows, and it is sure that they will publish it as a letter to the editor, to protect himself from a lawsuit, of course," George answered. "This is outrageous." They had never gone so far in their attacks and insinuations. "Here they practically accuse my niece of having become with child before getting married, they insinuate that Lord Melbourne might not be the father, and they wonder if a bastard will sit on the throne. Of course they disguise it with a parable and without mentioning her by name, but it is quite clear who they are referring to," replied Leopold indignantly. "And will this be distributed on the streets?" Lord Melbourne asked, holding in his hands some pamphlets in which with rude drawings and hurtful phrases with vulgar allusions attacked Victoria's reputation. "Yes, you know I have the ability and money to get contacts even in the enemy camp. Cumberland is mobilizing all his resources to attack Her Majesty. It seems he is determined to embarrass the Queen," George replied. Lord Melbourne crumpled the papers and threw them on a table with contempt. "This must not be tolerated." Leopold exclaimed indignantly, "Lord Melbourne, we must take advantage of that scoundrel is here to have a very serious conversation with him," added the Belgian king. "I think we agree on that, sir," said Lord Melbourne, his face dark, his anger restrained. Leopold went to look for Cumberland, while Lord Melbourne and George talked, and George saw that the storm was announced in the face of his friend. Leopold returned with Cumberland and his inseparable assistant, Ludwig Schultz. "I do not think I know the gentleman, and I would prefer him to leave," said Cumberland as soon as he entered, seeing Lord George, who held his gaze defiantly. "The gentleman is Lord George MacPhail, Earl of Enniscorthy, my best friend and someone who has a lot to say about what we are going to discuss now, but I can ask you to leave if you ask your companion to leave. Since his presence here I do not consider it necessary," replied Lord Melbourne with firm tone and hard look. Captain Ludwig Schultz is my personal aide and escort, I have no secrets for him, and he will stay here with me, or there will be no conversation, Cumberland replied haughtily, while his assistant took out his emboldened chest and saw Lord Melbourne with rude contempt. In that case, Lord George also stays, said Lord Melbourne in a tone that did not allow discussion. Cumberland did not insist, and then the discussion began between Cumberland, Leopold, and Lord Melbourne, with Ludwig contemplating as a watchdog on alert, and George keeping silent and speaking only at Lord Melbourne's request to explain what he knew, while Cumberland denied it without much conviction. "This is intolerable, sir. For God, this is not worthy of a king and a prince of royal blood. To drag through the mud the reputation of your own niece, another queen anointed by God." Leopold exclaimed angrily. "At least my niece and me are monarchs anointed by God, not like other improvised monarchs whose crown has been offered to them as a second option by revolutionaries rebelling against their legitimate king," said Cumberland, offending Leopold, whose crown of King of the Belgians it was offered to him by the leaders of the revolution that made that country independent, after one of the King of France's sons rejected the crown. "But I think you overestimate my influence. The men behind these hateful writings are surely wrong in the way of expressing their criticisms, but they have the right, as subjects of this great country, to demand that the throne be occupied by a monarch of irreproachable conduct and to demand explanations when they have the fear that it is not so," Him added cynically. "These men, sir, are not really men, nor are they worthy of being subjects of this great country. They are scoundrels, scoundrels who sully the honor of a woman who is also their queen anointed by God. A queen who, if can boast of something, it is of an irreproachable behavior, unlike others," replied Lord Melbourne, trying to maintain self-control, but becoming more and more angry. "Yes, that was already you said in the Privy Council, Lord Melbourne. You made that day very clear what you think of the members of the royal family and of our behavior," Cumberland said with a look full of hatred, remembering how that Lord Melbourne had embarrassed him by remembering his dark and sinister past. "Sir, this does not do anyone any good, and certainly does not do it to you, because England will not forgive an uncle who disparages his own niece, who drags her reputation for the mud and exposes her to public contempt and humiliation, unless when the reason for doing so is to take away her crown or take revenge for not being able to do it. I think, sir, that the best thing you can do is accept once and for all that God chose your niece to be his anointed and not you. There is still time, you understand it, and amend your behavior," said Lord Melbourne as if he were making a very serious warning. "Maybe you're right, Lord Melbourne. But I think that God probably made a mistake in this case, or that my niece despised the gift that God gave her and is no longer worthy of being the anointed," answered Cumberland with a mocking smile and a cynical gesture on his face. "And why, sir?" Lord Melbourne asked as the gesture of his face hardened. "Because I have reason to believe that my niece was not a virgin when she got married, and that she was probably already with child," Cumberland replied in a perverse and cynical way, savouring every poisonous and offensive word. "Miserable scoundrel!" exclaimed Leopold, scandalised and furious, seeing with hatred Cumberland. Lord Melbourne clenched his fists and a deep rage was reflected on his face and his gaze. But he maintained an apparent serenity. "And I have reason to believe that you are a murderer, and I am sure you are a despicable scoundrel," Lord Melbourne replied without raising his voice, but with a cold tone full of contempt and anger. A current of tension shook all those present. They were all standing, Cumberland and Lord Melbourne face to face, with Leopold at their side, between them. Captain Schultz and George were a little apart from the other three, by the mantelpiece. When Cumberland heard the insult, his face grew livid with rage and he took a step back, as if he had been slapped. "How do you dare?" Cumberland exclaimed furiously. "In the same way that you dare to insult your niece and question her honor as a woman. But the difference is that while you defame her with lies, I'm just telling the truth, or you did not kill at least one time to a man," Lord Melbourne said without raising his voice but with more hatred and contempt. "Be careful what you say, scoundrel!" Captain Schultz exclaimed, defending his master. Be careful what you say, bastard. You are speaking to the consort of the Queen of England. George replied, defending his friend, and both men exchanged murderous glances. Gentlemen, please. We must not lose our manners, and Leopold exclaimed, trying to calm the situation. I demand that you ask me for forgiveness and that you retract of what you has said, cried Cumberland, addressing Lord Melbourne. I will do it when you apologize to Victoria and order your servants to stop messing with my wife's reputation, Lord Melbourne replied with cold anger. What can be expected from a man without honor? A poor idiot humiliated in front of the whole country for the slut of his first wife, the son of a woman who, answered Cumberland. Be careful with what you says about my mother, exclaimed Lord Melbourne, taking a few steps toward Cumberland in a threatening manner. Captain Schulz placed a hand on the hilt of his sword, a gesture that was warned by George that he surreptitiously stepped back and stood behind Schulz while looking for something with his eyes. The truth hurts. You carry the indecency in your blood. You're a dirty bastard who probably does not even know who your real father is, cried Cumberland, raising his voice and spitting out his hatred, addressing Lord Melbourne. Enough, Cumberland. You are exceeding yourself. Behave like a gentleman. Leopold exclaimed that he never thought he would defend Lord Melbourne. I'd rather be a dirty bastard than a murderer and a scoundrel coward who spreads lies about his young niece to deprive her of what is rightfully hers, exclaimed Lord Melbourne, raising his voice. You two are worthy of each other. You are the best person to marry her, because you are already used to being a cuckold, because after all my niece Victoria is not better than a Billingsgate woman, cried Cumberland with all his wickedness and contempt, referring to the women who worked as prostitutes in the infamous London neighbourhood of Billingsgate. And then everything exploded. Cumberland fell on his back, sitting on a sofa, when he suffered a heavy blow to his face. Lord Melbourne had punched him in the face, a brutal blow with all the strength of his brawny right arm. Captain Schulz unsheathed his sword and made an attempt to throw himself at Lord Melbourne, but then there was a loud noise, a thud, followed by the noise of an object exploding. It was the result of the blow that George gave Schulz on the head with a large vase he had taken from a corner. The vase exploded into 1,000 pieces when George slammed into the head of the Hanoverian officer, who fell to the ground, lying face down, while a thin thread of blood began to sprout from a wound in his head and to stain the ground. George hurried to lean down and took the sword from Schulz's hand, and then placed the sharp point of the sword on the back of Schulz's neck, and pressed it against it without nail it. Meanwhile he placed one foot on the officer's back and another foot on the arm with which he had held the sword, to immobilize him. Meanwhile, Lord Melbourne grabbed Cumberland by the lapels of the suit and picked him up violently from the sofa, as if he were a dummy, and pushed him against the wall, causing the back of Cumberland's head to hit the wall. Cumberland was bleeding from the nose. Leopold watched the scene with wide eyes, with surprise and scandal on his face, impacted. Baroness Lazen was walking through the room where the party was held, near the door of the room where the scene between the men took place, while she watched with her hawk eyes to make sure that the employees complied correctly with their duties to attend to the guests. She saw Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, who was a few steps away from her, and they exchanged suspicious glances as always when they saw each other, since both women competed for affection as Victoria's daughter. The Baroness was going to continue on her way, when she heard a loud rumble coming from the adjacent room, the unmistakable noise of something exploding and breaking. In spite of the music that accompanied the couples that danced, and the noise produced by the voices of the guests who talked while the others danced, the people closest to the door of the room also heard the loud noises that came from inside, and they turned to see the door of the small room. The Baroness went to the door and opened it, hoping to find a clumsy employee who had broken some furniture ornaments, but when she entered she found the shocking scene of Lord Melbourne lifting Cumberland and practically knocking him against a wall, and on the other hand Lord Melbourne's friend, Lord George, threatening a sword and pinning a Hanoverian officer under his feet. The Baroness hurried to close the door behind her but saw that the Duchess of Kent was coming towards them, probably attracted by curiosity. "Please, Your Highness, do not let Dina get close," If you love her, do not let her see what happens here in her current condition," exclaimed Baroness Lazen in the Duchess's ear, at the door of the small room, while the Baroness kept the door half closed and with her body blocked the vision so that those who were outside could not see well what was happening inside. The Duchess glimpsed Leopold's pale face over shoulder of Baroness and saw Lazen's anguished gesture, and then nodded and walked away, while the Baroness closed the door. The Duchess made her way among guests who murmured among themselves, conjecturing what was happening in that room. Victoria's mother signaled to a servant who approached her in a hurry. "Tell the orchestra on behalf of the mother of the Queen that from now on they only play very happy music, which makes couples dance with a lot of energy, the most strident as possible, and that they touch it as high as possible," said the Duchess, trying to make the music hide the noises that came from the room attached. The employee nodded and walked away to comply with the order. Then the Duchess saw Victoria approaching and hurried out to meet her. "Mama, I cannot find Lord M and I do not see Uncle Leopold either, do not you know if they're talking somewhere?" Victoria asked normally, without suspecting what was happening. "Don't worry, they will appear, they must be talking somewhere, in some corner. Come on, I want to introduce you to someone, a German baroness who knows your sister," said the Duchess, grabbing her daughter by the arm and pulling her. "Mama, you're dragging me." "I'm coming, I'm with child and I cannot run," Victoria replied, a little annoyed. Inside the room, Lazen watched horrified what was happening. "Bastard, you will not call my wife a prostitute in my presence. I'll kill you if you call prostitute to Victoria again," exclaimed Lord Melbourne furiously as he had never been in his life before, while still holding Cumberland by the lapels of his suit. Lazen covered her mouth with one hand and then saw Cumberland with anger. "Lord Melbourne, have you gone crazy?" Leopold said, scandalized. Captain Schulz tried to move but felt the cutting edge of the tip of the sword against the back of his neck and the feet of Lord George immobilizing his arm and his back. "Don't move, son of a bitch. Unless you want me to kill you. Do you know how they kill bulls in a bullfight in Spain? I've seen them, they kill them with a sword thrust in the nape, as I think I will do to you if you move, bastard," said George in a malevolent voice and threatening tone. Lazen watched in horror as George threatened Schulz. "You bastard! You have attacked me. I will not forgive this offense. You'll pay me," Cumberland exclaimed, struggling with Lord Melbourne to get rid of him, but Lord Melbourne was stronger and kept him cornered against the wall. "Do you want a satisfaction to your honor, you damned scoundrel? Excellent. I'll be happy to give it to you. Do you want a duel? I will gladly accept, just tell me the date and time," Lord Melbourne said with anger and hatred, with the least control over his emotions that he had had in his life. No, Lord Melbourne. Please, think of Dina. She needs you. It's not worth risking it. She would die if something bad happens to you," Baroness Lazen pleaded with her voice broken by anguish and moist eyes. "Gentlemen, please. This has gone too far. I beg you to recover your sanity," said Leopold, desperate and afraid of what might happen. "Do you think I'm afraid of you because you're younger? I am not afraid of you. Enchanted I will fight a duel with you to avenge this outrage on my honor," Cumberland replied, red with anger and trembling with emotion, with defiant look. Schulz tried to move but George pressed the tip of the sword to the back of his neck and a small trickle of blood gushed from the point where the sword pressed against his skin. "Make me happy, you damned German bastard. Give me an excuse to kill you," Lord George said in a tone that left no doubt of his intention to fulfill his threat. Tears of rage, impotence, and humiliation began to flow from the eyes of the arrogant Captain Schulz. "It would be a nice change if you tried to kill a man face to face, facing him like a man and a gentleman, instead of slicing him his neck in the bed," Lord Melbourne replied with deep contempt, reminding Cumberland of the crime of which he was accused many years before. "I am a prince of royal blood and you are a dirty bastard. A miserable viscount, a title you have only because your mother's harlot," replied Cumberland, but could not continue. Lord Melbourne squeezed Cumberland's neck with one hand, cutting off his breath. If you mention my mother again with your dirty mouth, I will kill you. I will not tolerate you insulting Victoria or my mother. It will be me who will challenge you to a duel to kill you like a dog, Lord Melbourne said, shaking with rage. Enough, enough! Leopold shouted desperately, trying to stop what was happening. Lazen rolled up her skirts and ran to another door, different from the one she had used to enter the room, and left. The men stayed, wrapped up in the violent situation. Cumberland shouted insults to Lord Melbourne, and Lord Melbourne responded in the same way. George was still threatening Schultz, and Leopold was trying to stop the scene. Gentlemen, please. You are behaving like animals. A king, the consort of a Queen of England, and an English lord behaving like beasts. I demand that you stop this madness. Leopold shouted almost hysterically. But the other men ignored him and continued confronting each other until the door through which Lazen had left opened and a figure entered through it. Gentlemen! What a beautiful picture! It reminds me of some of the battles I fought on the continent, the Duke of Wellington said sarcastically and mockingly, but with a firm and authoritative tone, and the steel look he used to intimidate his troops and make them obey. All were frozen, bowing to the powerful presence of the old Duke. Please, subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow me on my Instagram profile, whose link appears in the description of this video.